So what I would like to do is give a brief introduction to the healing paradigm that we're using at these groups called Healing at the Edge. Many of us have practiced Asian meditative contemplative practices, and it has been my experience both as a meditator and as a meditation teacher that for many people, we get to a certain point and there's a block in our practice. And I believe the reason for that, which I've found out only very long, hard struggles of my own, is that these practices were developed by and for people thousands of years ago who are grounded and centered, unneurotic, and love their parents. And for many of us in the West, we tend to be ungrounded, uncentered, have some neurotic tendencies, and often have conflicted relationships with our parents. So that this grand project we're embarking upon of learning to disidentify with ego structure and egoic patterns in the body and emotions and begin to identify with our true nature or higher power or Buddha nature or Christ consciousness is going to be a very difficult project if we begin from this neurotic standpoint. So one of the things we do in this group is do a lot of foundation work of looking very carefully at what kind of experiences get us ungrounded, shoot us up into our heads, get us uncentered, pull us out of our bellies, and particularly if something is difficult. It's much easier then to just jump up in the mind and start thinking about things rather than staying with the difficult experience. Whether it's a grieving experience, whether it's a feeling of being attacked, whether it's a feeling of inadequacy, all different kinds of experiences. The ego structure likes to put itself at the center of the universe and say, I've got a problem here, let's think about the problem. And as long as you're thinking about the problem, the ego, as uncomfortable as it is ultimately content because it's the star of its own movie. And everybody else is just a bit player. Whereas when we're really working with our emotions and what's going on in our body, then the ego is beginning to dissolve and it's not so happy. So the ego is put in a very difficult situation that it's the object of our practice, looking at what patterns are arising, and at the same time, it's the subject. It's the part of us that's telling us how we should be practicing. So there's a very profound conflict of interest there for the ego that we're trying to pay attention to it, to heal it and dissolve it, but at the same time, it's trying to protect itself and telling us how to do practice. So we have, together here, been working with this paradigm. And the paradigm consists of 3 different channels of working with the material that arises. The body channel, which is Western somatics. The mind channel, which is Western psychology and Buddhist practice. And the heart channel, the spirit channel of devotion. And there are 5 different levels or stages of healing as we progress from the beginning to the end. The first stage is motivation. As has been already suggested, when we're involved in this process, at times difficult experiences will arise that we're asked to pay attention to. And if our motivation for freedom isn't strong enough, that we will tend to distract ourselves. Let's have a glass of wine and turn on the television. I don't want to feel this way. Let me temporarily make it go away. And in the short term that works, but we know that in the long term it doesn't. So by deepening our motivation and beginning to really notice the difference between what does it feel like when we're free and open versus what does it feel like when we're lost in stickiness or biting the hook, and really in a very direct, naked way, feel the difference between those 2 life experiences, that begins to motivate us to turn towards the path of freedom. In Buddhism, they have what are called the 4 mind mind-turning truths, the truths that turn our mind toward the practice of the Dharma. The first mind-turning truth is you're going to die, but you don't know when. The second truth is life is precious. The third truth is what we do, think, or say has an effect. There is karma. And the fourth truth is that there is suffering in this world. Now, those truths are intellectually obvious to anybody who has thought about life just a little bit. You're going to die, but you don't know when. Life is precious. There's karma. There's suffering. But if we really, really knew that we were going to die, but we didn't know that we were going to be alive at the end of this talk, at the end of this next sentence, how would it change the way you related to the next breath, to the next sentence that came out of my mouth? How would it change the way that you and I were connected in this moment? How would it change the way that you were relating to your own experiences, your reactions to what's coming up as you're hearing what I'm saying? How deeply are you willing to love what is going on, even if it isn't pleasant? So having this motivation is a very useful beginning point. The next stage I call invocation, and it is really learning to trust that we can be present in the heart, present in the body, present in the mind. From the standpoint of Buddhism, it's the Hinayana or Theravada school of Buddhism. Vipassana, learning to pay attention, trusting that just awareness itself, without trying to fix, improve, manipulate, but clear awareness is something that can be trusted and will lead us toward freedom. From the standpoint of the heart, we invoke from our heart that which we trust. Our heart trusts something, whether it's the higher power or living spirit or the spirit of truth or Buddha or Christ or the mother, whatever name for that you have, doesn't make any difference what name it is. But that thing the heart trusts, not even that thing, but that quality that the heart trusts that is beyond the mind. But let's even look a little more deeply at the invocation stage from the standpoint of the body. What does it mean to trust and be embodied, to be in your body? The beginning of embodiment, when a small child is born, the first thing that she learns for the first 2 years of her life is being grounded. Trusting that it's okay to be dependent and that you are being supported by the earth and by the mother, that you're held. As you crawl across the floor is going to be there. As your mother holds you, she's not going to drop you on the floor. That you can trust this quality of being dependent. You can relax into being supported and grounded and nourished. Now, if you had an enlightened mother, this process happened very, very deeply. But for almost all of us, we had a mother who probably loved us a lot, but had her own issues, and the grounding piece happened only partially. Then at the age of 2, the terrible twos begin, and we begin to move from being dependent to being independent or autonomous. And the energetic quality that we have to learn, this little theoretical girl has to learn, is moving from being grounded and connected, the lower part of your body connected with the earth, to moving up into your belly center, the hara, the dantian, the place a few inches below your navel and inside the front of your body, from which martial arts are done, which allows us to be independent and autonomous. I am me. I am centered. I am here on this planet. As this quality of being dependent that I previously learned is now allowing me to be an independent person. And if you didn't go through the grounding piece too well, then it's going to be difficult to go through the being down in your belly completely. So for many of us, when we're meditating as a way of escaping those qualities in our life that are difficult because they throw us into ungroundedness and uncenteredness. And it's very, very useful to go back and learn to have these abilities. As I said before, most of these practices assume that you're grounded and centered already. And the Dalai Lama on his third trip to America said, "Now I'm beginning to understand, and it makes me very sad, you Americans don't like yourselves. And if you don't like yourself and you begin to disidentify with who you think you are, it doesn't take too much imagination to begin to see that all kinds of problems are going to arise." So learning the qualities of being grounded and centered, trusting being in your body, trusting that you can just be in your heart, trusting that you can be in your mind and just pay attention without having to understand the way the Bible talks about the peace that passes understanding, is the first stage on the path. And as we learn to be present then for what's going on, one of the things we're present for is the suffering that arises in our bodies, in our minds, and in the people around us. And as we become autonomous and centered enough, the heart begins to open. We begin to trust that the heart can open. The belly supports the opening heart. And the heart then is the heart of compassion. Compassion, the ability to keep your heart open in the presence of suffering. Stephen Levine defines compassion very poetically. Compassion is the ability to keep your heart open in hell. So Rumi has this wonderful quote, "Grief is the garden of compassion." Grief has the quality of separation. We feel sad or angry or fearful or upset because we feel separate. Somebody has died, we've lost a relationship, we've lost an identity. We feel separate, and we feel a negative emotion arising in response to that. Compassion has the quality of connectedness. And one way of talking about the spiritual path is learning to transmute grief into compassion. Grief is the garden of compassion. What grows in the garden? Something beautiful, something we can eat, something we can look at and see as beautiful. A fruit or a vegetable. And what grows in the garden of grief is compassion. If we can be in that garden and till that garden and do our grief work with what is separate, what causes suffering, then we can begin to open our hearts. Now, if the belly, if this feeling of independence is not strong, the heart will be open only when it feels safe, because there's not a strong sense of I-ness, of independence, of centeredness, of autonomy. So if the environment is not supporting your open heart, or the heart of somebody else, the heart closes. How many times have you been around somebody and they're really open-hearted and loving, and then in the next minute something is said or the piece of music changes or whatever, and the person completely closes? And that's because they or you does not have a strong enough quality of being centered, and the heart is only going to be remaining open when the environment is supporting that. So the belly supports the heart being open. At the same time, the heart of compassion makes workable the material that will come bubbling up as we learn to be centered. Because as we go through our lives, we repress emotion, we suppress grief, we shove it down in there so that we can have a life, so that we can raise a family, have a job, feel entertained in various ways, and keep this grief that we all have. We've lost part of our childhood dream, we've lost loved ones, we've lost certain identities. And as we lose these things, we process them partly, but often only partly, and repress the rest of it. So there is this reservoir of grief hanging out down in the belly. And as we learn to be centered, this stuff begins to come up, which on one hand can be seen as difficult or problematic, but on the other hand, it's arising at the perfect moment. What comes arising out of the belly is saying, I'm ready to be healed now. Can you be aware of me? I haven't been embraced for so very long. Can you embrace me? Can you open your heart of compassion to me? So that what we're doing with our meditation practice here is not trying to become a great meditator, but to use meditation to begin to see these patterns that have been often unconscious for a very long time, and by identifying these patterns, then beginning to have compassion for those places that have been causing us conditioned habitual suffering. My own example, which I know so well, I'll briefly mention. When I was young, I had 2 severe electrical shocks. Putting a hairpin in an electrical outlet, my first memory in life, 9 months old, and then about 3 years later, putting a fork in a toaster and getting hooked into the toaster and not being able to let go until my mother came from far away in the house. So I learned at a very young age that the world is not safe. That if I wasn't careful, that just by following my curiosity, look, those 2 prongs go in those 2 holes, isn't that great? And in doing that, got a very rude awakening. Or my mother finally said, you're old enough to make your own toast. Isn't that great? I can make my own toast, put on all the jam and butter I want, and I'm putting the fork in the toaster, and I'm hooked into the alternating current that's going through my body. So I learned that life is dangerous. And I grew up, I started becoming a meditator, I went to a lot of retreats, had a really busy mind, partly because I had all this training as a mathematician, which promoted having a busy mind, an analytical mind. And as long as I just kept paying attention to all those thoughts, they would quiet down, but then they would come back again. At the end of a retreat, my mind would be very calm, and then a few days later, the neurotic structure would reappear. But when I finally got into some bodily-based way of looking at what was going on, I realized that I wasn't just thinking, but that I was feeling unsafe, and I was planning ways of not getting shocked again. Not electrically, but thinking if I was hyper-vigilant enough and planning carefully enough, I wouldn't be shocked. I could take care of myself. I would be safe. Okay, so the notion was then that if I kept planning, everything would be okay. And when I began to understand that, I could, instead of just paying attention to each thought, I could take a step back and begin to have compassion for the place in me that didn't feel safe. And when I finally met that place with an open heart, it began to really relax. It was almost as if it was saying, finally you're willing to hear me. Finally you're willing to pay attention. Okay, so we've talked about getting grounded, getting centered, leading then to a feeling of open-heartedness and the energetic quality in the body that goes along with compassion that happens after somebody's grounded and centered is having appropriate boundaries. Suffering arises. There are 3 possible responses. Overly rigid boundaries. I don't want to feel that. The suffering is too close to me on the couch here. I don't want to feel that. Let me push it away. It's too much for me right now. My brother, who has stage 4 pancreatic cancer, was informed of his diagnosis and prognosis by a doctor in an after-hours email. And the doctor wrote him an email saying, we're putting you on palliative care. There's nothing we can do. So I'm not here to blame the doctor. The doctor was not trained to deal with that quality of human suffering. But his boundary was such that he didn't want to deal with the suffering that would arise in my brother when he got that news. Okay. Possibility number 2, suffering arises overly permeable boundaries. Oh my God, what a problem. Your problem is my problem. This really upsets me. What can we do about this? Now, if you had a problem and either one of those 2 people showed up, the overly rigidly bounded person, overly permeable bounded person, how much could they really help you? How much could they really be there in a sense of spiritual healing, spiritual, emotional support? But there is a third possibility: appropriate boundaries, compassion. I feel what you're going through. I'm empathetic. I can feel it in my heart. I hope that your suffering is alleviated, but and I don't have to push it away, but at the same time, I'm not going to get lost in it. I'm going to be able to keep my heart open, because in truth, the nature of the heart is boundless. So that is compassion. And the compassionate heart has certain qualities. One is this quality of connectedness that distinguishes it from grief. The second quality is warmth. The third quality is spaciousness. Spaciousness in the sense there's not a lot of I who's saying, I'm feeling compassion, but just the heart is opening. Okay? So when the heart opens enough and the I dissolves enough, then the next stage of empowerment, Vajrayana Buddhism, if you will, begins to arise. That which we invoked in the beginning is revealed to be who we actually are. That Christ consciousness or Buddha nature or your own true nature, that's who you are. It's not something we're calling forth and hoping it shows up. That it really is who we are all along. And finally, when we feel empowered enough, it moves to the final stage of wholeness or healing, non-duality, Adyashanti, Eckhart Tolle, Ramana Maharshi, some wonderful teachers talk about those things. And yet at the same time, it's very difficult to rest in non-duality until one has gone through these initiations, if you will, of invoking in body, mind, and spirit, getting grounded and centered, letting your heart of compassion open, realizing that you are that sacred quality that you invoked. And then finally it begins to become clear that the content of any experience is a pure manifestation of true nature. Life and death, happiness and sadness, busy mind, calm mind, all of those are equally faces of the beloved. But it's very easy to pretend you're there and say, I understand non-duality, so I can do whatever I want. I can cause problems over here and take money over there because it's all the same. It's all one. It's all one taste. And it is one taste, but really, until you are clearly aware of and compassionate toward what it is that's going on out there, it's very, very dangerous to start being a bull in the china shop of life and pretending you know what non-duality is about. So that is a very brief summary.